The morning Alice Archer walked into the Dodge City Land office with nothing but a handwritten deed description, $37 in a flour sack, and a jaw set hard enough to crack stone. Every man in that building turned to look at her like she had walked in wearing a buffalo on her head. It was the spring of 1882, and the Kansas plains were still breathing with that raw, electric promise that only newly opened territory can carry. The Homestead Act had been law for 20 years by then, but the idea of a woman standing alone at a government counter and filing a claim without a husband's signature behind her was still the kind of thing that made men reach for their hats and their objections at the same time. Alice was 26 years old, 5 feet and 4 inches of stubbornness, wrapped in a faded blue calico dress, with dark chestnut hair pinned back in a way that refused to stay where it was put. Her eyes were the color of good river water, green-gray and clear, and they did not flinch when 3 men stared. She had ridden 11 miles from the boarding house in Spearville that morning on a borrowed mare, and the ride had given her plenty of time to rehearse what she would say and very little time to talk herself out of it. She knew the law. She had read the Homestead Act until the pages were soft from handling. She knew that any citizen over 21 could file. It said citizen. It did not say husband. It did not say man. It said citizen, and Alice Alina Archer was every inch of one. The land office clerk was a pale man named Gerald Sutton, with ink-stained fingers and a neck that seemed perpetually surprised by the collar sitting around it. He looked at Alice across the counter and blinked. "Can I help you, ma'am?" he said, and the words came out slow like he was still deciding if that was the right question. "You can," Alice said. She set her flour sack on the counter with a soft thud and reached inside for the folded papers. "I'm here to file a homestead claim. 160 acres on the southeast quarter of Section 14, Township 26, Range 23. I have the filing fee right here." Sutton looked at the papers. He looked at the money she set beside them. He looked at Alice. Then he looked at the papers again. "Is your husband filing with you, ma'am?" "I do not have a husband," Alice said. "The act requires a citizen over the age of 21 who is the head of a family, or who has never borne arms against the United States. I am 26, I was born in Ohio, I am a citizen, and I have never once raised a weapon against this government. I qualify." Sutton scratched the back of his neck. "Well, ma'am, it is just that we do not usually." "I am not asking what you usually do," Alice said, and her voice did not rise, which somehow made it more formidable. "I am asking you to do what the law says you must." That was when the door behind her opened, letting in a gust of spring wind and a man who smelled like horses and long miles. Roscoe Cooper was 29 years old, and he had the look of someone who had spent the majority of those years outdoors, which he had. He was tall, broad across the shoulders, with sun-dark skin and dark brown hair that curled slightly at the ears beneath the brim of a dusty gray hat. He had a jaw that was not quite as stubbornly set as Alice's, but it was close, and his eyes were a warm, deep brown, the kind that absorbed light rather than reflected it. He worked for the Carlisle cattle outfit 12 miles east of Dodge, had done so for 6 years, and he had ridden into town that morning to pick up wire and shipping papers. He had not expected to walk into the middle of anything. He heard the tail end of Alice's words to the clerk, and he read the situation in a single glance the way a man who has spent years reading weather and cattle and trouble learns to do. The clerk was going to stall. The woman was not going to leave. And there were 2 other men at the far side of the office who had put down their own papers and were watching with the particular attention of men who smell an opportunity to involve themselves. Roscoe took off his hat and walked to the counter beside Alice. Not in front of her, beside her. "Morning," he said pleasantly to the clerk. "Is there a problem with this lady's filing?" The clerk straightened. "Now this is between me and the—" "I am just asking," Roscoe said. "Because if there is a legal problem, that is one thing. But if there is not a legal problem and you are just slow about it, I have got shipping papers to pick up and I would appreciate getting through this line." Alice turned to look at the man who had appeared at her elbow. She had not asked for help. She was not entirely certain she wanted it. But there was something in his manner that was not condescending, was not the sticky, proprietary kindness of a man who planned to make her feel grateful. He was simply standing there, hat in his hand, waiting, like a person who had somewhere to be and had made a practical decision about how to move things along. "He thinks I cannot file without a husband," Alice said, watching Roscoe's face. Roscoe nodded slowly. "He is wrong about that," he said, addressing this equally to Alice and to the clerk. "My sister filed a claim in Nebraska 2 years ago. Widow, entirely alone. The law is clear enough." Sutton's expression shifted. Being corrected by one person was bad enough. Being corrected by two, one of whom clearly knew his business and was not going to be moved by a long pause, was something else. "I will need to check the documentation," the clerk said, and his voice had lost its certainty. "That is fine," Alice said. "Take your time." It took 40 minutes. 2 more clerks were consulted. A ledger was brought out. The section of the Homestead Act was read aloud twice, once by a clerk and once, with quiet precision, by Alice herself when she felt they had misread a subordinate clause. At one point the 2 men from the far side of the room drifted closer, and one of them, a heavy-set man in a brown vest named Harlan Pruitt, who Alice would come to know as a significant source of trouble, said that it was a crying shame what the law had come to if any woman could walk in off the street and take land away from proper settlers. Roscoe turned and looked at Harlan Pruitt with an expression that was not aggressive but was absolute. "She is not taking land from anybody," he said. "She is filing on unclaimed land, same as anyone else. Same as you did, I expect, Mr. Pruitt." Harlan Pruitt knew Roscoe Cooper from the cattle trade, and he knew better than to push directly. He made a sound that was not quite a word and went back to his side of the office. At the end of the 40 minutes, Gerald Sutton stamped Alice Archer's claim, took her $37.45 in filing fees, and handed her the receipt with the expression of a man who has been asked to do something against the natural order of the universe, but has concluded that fighting about it today is not worth the headache. Alice folded the receipt and placed it very carefully in the flour sack. Outside on the boardwalk, she stopped and breathed the spring air and did not let herself make any sound at all, because if she had, she was not certain what it would have been. Something between a laugh and a sob, probably, and she was not going to do either on the main street of Dodge City with people walking past. "Thank you," she said, when she heard boots on the boards behind her. She turned to find the tall cowboy, who had collected his hat again and set it back on his head at the angle of a man entirely at ease with who he was. "You did not need me," he said. "You had it." "I had it," she agreed. "But you made it faster," he nodded. There was a pause that was not awkward exactly, but was the kind that happens between 2 people who have just done something unusual together and have not yet established what category of acquaintance they are. "Roscoe Cooper," he said, and offered his hand. "Alice Archer," she said, and shook it. Her grip was firm, he noticed. "You have got a claim now," he said. "You going to work it alone?" "That is the plan," she said. He looked at her. Not assessingly, not the way men sometimes looked at women alone and did arithmetic on their vulnerability. He looked at her the way he might have looked at a stretch of difficult country he respected. "Good luck to you, Miss Archer," he said. "Thank you, Mr. Cooper," she said. He went to pick up his wire and his shipping papers. She went to get her borrowed mare. And that might have been the end of it, except that Dodge City in 1882 was not so large a place that 2 people once met could fully avoid each other, and Harlan Pruitt was not the kind of man who forgot a public embarrassment. Alice's land was southeast of town, 160 acres of gently rolling Kansas grassland with a creek cutting through the lower third, and a low bluff on the north edge that would serve as a windbreak come winter. She had identified it 3 months ago, had ridden out 4 times to walk every corner of it, had drawn her own map, and had known with the certainty of something settled deep in the chest that this was the place. Her father had been a farmer in Ohio who died of a fever when Alice was 17, leaving her mother and 3 younger siblings on a rented farm. Alice had worked as a seamstress, a cook, a school teacher for 2 years in a town called Caldwell just south of the Kansas border, and she had saved with the focus of someone who understood exactly what money was for. 160 acres of her own, a house, a garden, chickens, then a milk cow, then whatever came after that. A life that belonged to no one but her. She had a canvas tent and a load of supplies from the general store, loaded onto a rented wagon, and she drove it out to her claim the following morning. The prairie was enormous around her, the sky even more so, and the grass bent in the wind in long, silver-green waves that she thought were one of the most beautiful things she had ever seen. She set the tent on the high ground near the bluff, unloaded her supplies, and stood with her hands on her hips looking at the creek glittering in the morning sun, and she felt something she had not felt in a very long time, perhaps ever, like a person who had arrived. She had a great deal of work to do, and she knew it. The law required 5 years of residence and improvement to prove up a homestead claim. She needed to break sod, plant crops, and build a structure substantial enough to demonstrate genuine settlement. She had a small amount of money left, a good back, and considerable experience with hard work. What she did not have, and what became apparent within the first week, was protection from Harlan Pruitt. Pruitt had 500 acres north and west of Alice's claim, land he had run cattle over for 3 years. He had not formally claimed much of it under the Homestead Act, because he found it convenient to use more territory than he was legally entitled to, a common enough practice among men who had arrived early and established themselves before the rules caught up. Alice's claim sat on land that he had assumed would remain unclaimed, because it was isolated and the creek access made it valuable, and no one, he had expected, would be foolish enough to challenge his informal arrangement. He was wrong, and he was not gracious about being wrong. The first incident was minor. Her supply wagon was tampered with while she was down at the creek one afternoon, her flour sack cut and most of it ruined. She could not prove it was Pruitt's men, but the boot prints near the wagon were large and the cut was deliberate, not the work of an animal. She replaced the flour, set a sharper watch on her supplies, and said nothing to anyone. The second incident was not minor. 3 of Pruitt's cattle were run through her newly planted garden patch, churning it to mud, and when she went to Pruitt's ranch to address this directly, his foreman told her, with elaborate politeness, that cattle were unpredictable and she should fence her garden if she did not want it disturbed. "Fencing is your responsibility when you run cattle near a settled claim," Alice said, and the foreman smiled the smile of a man who expects the conversation to be over shortly because he is talking to a woman alone. She rode back to her tent and sat for a while by the creek and thought carefully about her position. She was stubborn, but she was not stupid, and stubbornness alone would not fix a destroyed garden or protect her supplies. She needed the kind of presence that even Harlan Pruitt would think twice about. It was not a comfortable thought. She had not come out here to depend on anyone. But there was a difference, she reasoned, between depending on someone and making an alliance, and a person who rejected all alliances on principle was a person who ended up alone in the middle of a Kansas plain trying to outsmart a man with 50 ranch hands. She rode to Dodge City the following Saturday, not for any one reason, but because she needed supplies and information and perhaps, if she was honest, a conversation with someone who had some knowledge of the local landscape of power. She was standing at the general store counter when she heard a familiar voice behind her. "Miss Archer," she turned. Roscoe Cooper was leaning against the door frame with a paper-wrapped parcel under his arm and the same easy quality about him that she had noticed in the land office, like a man who had made his peace with himself a long time ago and found the settlement comfortable. "Mr. Cooper," she said. "How is the claim coming along?" he asked, and it was a genuine question, not a pleasantry. She told him. All of it, including Pruitt's cattle and the flour sack, and the foreman's smile, because there was something in the directness of his gaze that made evasion feel like an unnecessary use of energy. Roscoe listened without interrupting, and when she finished, he was quiet for a moment with an expression she could not quite read. "Pruitt has run that game on 3 other people," he said at last. "2 of them left. The third one is still there barely because he has 3 sons." "I do not have 3 sons," Alice said. "No," Roscoe agreed. "But Pruitt is afraid of documentation. He does not like things written down because he has several informal arrangements that would not survive close examination. You should write everything down, every incident, date, time, what was damaged, what it cost to replace, if you can get any witnesses." Alice looked at him. "That is useful," she said. "I could ride out," Roscoe said, and he said it carefully, not like an offer to rescue but like a suggestion between equals. "Not to do anything in particular, just to be visible. Pruitt knows me. He knows the Carlisle outfit would not appreciate one of their riders being interfered with, and being on neighboring land is close enough to interfere with. It might buy you some peace while you get established." Alice was quiet for longer than was comfortable. She was thinking about what it would cost to accept this, not in money but in the other currency of obligation and expectation that she had spent her adult life being careful about. "Why?" she said at last. Roscoe seemed to find this a perfectly reasonable question. He thought about it, which she appreciated. He did not say anything immediately, which meant he was actually considering his answer rather than producing the most convenient one. "Because what Pruitt does is wrong," he said. "And because I have ridden past that quarter section and it is good land and someone ought to work it. And because you struck me as someone who deserved a fair chance." He paused. "And because I have got a half day on Sundays and nothing particular to do with it." It was the last part that decided her, because it was honest and a little self-deprecating, and made the offer feel less like charity. "All right," she said. "Sunday, then." He came on Sunday. He rode out on a big roan horse named Calico that was a contradiction of its name in every possible way, being neither small nor patterned but a single deep red-brown. He wore his work clothes and brought nothing with him but his presence and a mild curiosity about the landscape, and he rode the perimeter of Alice's claim with her in the morning like a man on a casual inspection. By mid-morning, 3 of Pruitt's hands had appeared on the northern ridge and watched for a while, and then disappeared again. By afternoon, they did not return. Roscoe stayed for the supper Alice made over the campfire, which was beans and salt pork and cornbread cooked in a Dutch oven, which he ate without commentary and with evident appetite. She had coffee, strong and dark, and they sat on either side of the fire as the sun went down over the prairie and turned the sky colors that had no adequate names. "Do you like it?" he asked, looking out at the flat dark horizon. "The land?" "More than I expected," she said. "I came from Ohio. Everything there is smaller, the sky is smaller. This feels like it has not finished deciding what it will be yet." "It has not," he said. "That is the thing about this country, it is still choosing." "So am I," she said, without thinking about it first, and then was slightly startled by how true it was. He looked at her across the fire, and there was something in his expression that she could not name but filed away carefully, the way you file away something valuable when you are not yet sure what to do with it. He came the following Sunday, and the one after that. It became a pattern without either of them formally establishing one, the way patterns sometimes do when 2 people are being very careful not to make assumptions, but are quietly making them anyway. He would ride out in the morning, help her with whatever she was working on, which had progressed from site preparation to the serious business of sod breaking and the laying of a foundation for a proper sod house, and stay through supper and a little while after. He was useful with his hands in an unshowy way, competent and efficient, and he never once suggested that she was doing anything wrong or should do it differently unless she asked him directly, at which point he would give her an honest answer. She found she liked him in a way that surprised her. She had liked men before, had come close to marrying one in Caldwell, a schoolteacher named Edmund who was gentle and kind, and who had eventually been unable to reconcile himself to the fact that Alice was not interested in a smaller life, than the one she was already designing for herself. She did not think of Roscoe as a similar possibility, not at first, or at least she told herself she did not, with the particular self-deception of a person who is thinking about something so often that they have to work very hard at not noticing. She noticed things about him, though. The way he listened, fully, without preparing his next sentence while you were still talking. The way he laughed, not often, but when something genuinely struck him as funny, which was real and warm and made other things around it brighter. The way he handled his horse, with a light hand and a patience that extended to the animal's moods as if they were worth respecting. The way he looked at the prairie as if it mattered. She noticed that he did not talk about himself very much, not evasively but simply because he did not seem to think his own history was particularly interesting, which she found unusual enough to be curious. She asked him once over coffee what had brought him to Kansas. He was quiet for a moment. "Same as most," he said, "looking for something that fit." Other pause. "I grew up in Missouri. My father ran horses. We did not agree about most things eventually. I left at 20 and came west and found work with cattle, which I am good at, and here is where the work was." He shrugged, but it was not dismissive. "I am not unhappy here." "Are you happy?" she asked, because the distinction seemed important. He thought about this, which was something she had already learned to expect from him, that he did not throw away answers. "More than I was," he said. "Less than I would like." She wanted to ask what more would look like, but she did not, because she was fairly certain she knew, and she was not ready to know that yet. The sod house went up in June. It was not beautiful. Sod houses never were, being essentially rectangles of stacked earth with a wooden door frame and two small windows. But it was solid and cool in summer and warm in winter, and it was hers, entirely and legally hers. And when she stood in the doorway for the first time on the evening it was finished and looked out at the creek and the grass and the evening light, she felt something that was very close to joy. Roscoe had helped her with the final course of sod blocks, which required 2 people, and he was standing behind her and slightly to the left when she stopped in the doorway. She was aware of his proximity in a way she had been increasingly aware of it for several weeks, like a warmth at the edge of perception. "Well," he said, and his voice was quiet. "There it is." "There it is," she agreed. She turned to look at him and found he was already looking at her, and the quality of the look was something she had been carefully not acknowledging for at least a month. It was not forward or presumptuous. It was simply open in the way that very honest people sometimes are open, because they have not had enough practice disguising what they feel to become good at it. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "I should make supper." "I should help," he said. And they went inside her new house and made supper together, and the conversation was about the garden and the state of the north fence, and whether the creek ran high enough in spring to water a second field, and all of it was completely ordinary, and none of it was ordinary at all. Harlan Pruitt did not give up. Alice had expected this. What she had not entirely anticipated was that he would attempt to challenge the claim legally, and this was what he did in early July. He hired a lawyer from Wichita named Clement Foss, who had small eyes and large opinions, and Foss produced a document alleging that Alice's claim was invalid because, the document argued, the southeast quarter of Section 14 had already been subject to an informal grazing agreement predating her filing. This was not true, but it was the kind of not true that required documentation to disprove, and documentation required time and effort and money that Alice did not have in abundance. She received the notice of the legal challenge by Ryder on a Thursday morning in July, standing in front of her sod house with flour on her hands because she had been making bread, and she read it twice with the careful attention of someone who does not want to misunderstand bad news. She was frightened. She was also furious, which helped, because fury was more useful than fear. She rode to Dodge City that afternoon and went to the land office and asked to see every document associated with her claim and the surrounding territory. Sutton, who had developed a cautious respect for her over the past months, provided them without argument. She sat at the public table and read for 2 hours, and what she found was this. Prewitt's grazing agreement, which he had never formally filed, did not exist in any official record because he had never filed it. It was purely informal, which made it legally worthless. She rode back to her claim with a copy of the relevant portions, and she wrote out a careful and detailed response to the legal challenge by lamplight that evening. She was not a lawyer, but she was a school teacher and she was a reader, and she knew how to construct an argument and support it with evidence. She was on the 3rd page when she heard hooves outside. Roscoe knocked on her door frame because the door was open at 8 in the evening with 2 provisions in his saddlebag that he said he had been in town and thought she might need, which was a practical pretext, and they both knew it. She showed him the notice and her response. He read both, and his jaw did the thing she had noticed it did when he was holding something in. "This is good," he said of her response, "but you need a lawyer. I cannot afford a lawyer." "I know a man," Roscoe said. "In Dodge, Thomas Hale. He is a fair man and his fees are not unreasonable. He would take something on credit if you explain the situation." "I do not want to go into debt," Alice said. "I know you do not," he said, "but this is the kind of thing where a little debt now prevents a lot worse later." She looked at him across the lamplight table. She had been self-sufficient her entire adult life, and she found the need to ask for help in any form physically uncomfortable, like wearing shoes that were slightly too small. She knew this about herself, and she tried to be honest about whether it was a virtue or a form of pride. "I will go and see him," she said. Thomas Hale turned out to be a slight, dry man of about 50, with a careful way of speaking, and a respect for documentation that made him immediately useful. He read Alice's claim papers, read the challenge, read her written response, and nodded. "They do not have a legal leg to stand on," he said. "This grazing agreement was never filed because Prewitt knew it would not survive filing. He has been relying on intimidation to keep people off that land." He looked at Alice. "You are the first person who has pushed back with actual documentation." "I was a school teacher," Alice said. "I believe in documentation." Hale almost smiled. "My fee will be $15 for the response filing and representation at the review. If that is a hardship, I will take 10 now and 5 at your convenience." It was a hardship. She paid $10, and Hale filed the response, and in late August the Land Commissioner's office in Wichita reviewed the challenge and dismissed it. Prewitt's claim was without merit, the grazing agreement was not recognized, and Alice Archer's homestead filing was confirmed as valid. She received the confirmation on a warm August morning, standing in her garden, which had been replanted after the cattle incident and was now producing beans and squash and several rows of good corn. She read the letter twice, and then she sat down in the dirt between the bean rows, not because she was tired, because she was not, but because her legs seemed to have decided that sitting was appropriate to the moment. Roscoe found her there half an hour later when he rode out that Sunday, sitting in the bean rows with a confirmation letter in her hands and her face doing something complicated. He dismounted and came and crouched beside her in the beans and looked at her face. "Good news," he said. "The best," she said. Her voice was not quite steady. He reached out and put his hand over hers on the letter briefly, and then he did not move it, and she did not move her hand either, and they stayed like that for a minute in the warm August garden while the wind moved the corn and the creek said something quiet at the bottom of the hill. "Alice," he said, and her name in his voice had a quality she had not heard before. She looked at him. He was very close, crouched in the garden, his brown eyes warm and serious at the same time. "I'm not very good at saying things," he said. "I think you know that." "I do know that," she said. "You are better at it than you think." He took a breath. "I have been coming out here every Sunday for 5 months," he said, "and I know that is not a surprise to you, the reason for it. I think you have known for a while." "I have suspected," she said carefully. "I do not want to make assumptions about what you want," he said. "You have been very clear about being your own person, and I respect that. I will always respect that. But I think I would be doing both of us a disservice if I did not tell you that He stopped. He tried again. "I think about you," he said, "most of the time, more than is probably sensible." Alice looked at him for a long moment. There was the bean row and the warm air, and the sound of his horse moving somewhere behind them, and the letter in her hands that represented something she had fought for and won, entirely on her own terms. "I think about you too," she said, "more than is sensible." The relief that moved through his expression was visible and somewhat undignified, and she found it the most endearing thing she had ever seen on a human face. He leaned forward slowly, giving her every opportunity to decide otherwise, and kissed her, gently, there in the August garden with dirt on both their hands. It was not a dramatic kiss. It was, in its way, exactly like Roscoe himself, honest and careful and warmer than expected. She kissed him back and tasted dust and coffee and something sweet she could not name. When they broke apart, he sat back on his heels and looked at her with an expression of slightly wondering happiness, and she laughed, which surprised her, a real bright laugh that she had not produced in quite some time. "We are sitting in the bean rows," she observed. "We are," he agreed, grinning in a way she had not seen before, broad and unguarded. "I did not plan this very well." "No," she said, "but then I did not plan most of the good things that have happened to me either." He helped her up, and they walked down to the creek together and talked for a long time, the way people talk when they have been holding things in, and the holding in has just stopped being necessary. She told him about Ohio and her father and the years of saving, and what this land meant to her. He told her about Missouri and his father and a year when he was 22 that he had spent in Colorado that had been hard in ways he did not usually talk about. They talked until the sun was entirely gone and the Kansas stars came out in their extravagant numbers, and they sat by the creek in the dark, and he kept her hand in his and she let him, and it felt, she thought, like something that had been true for a long time finally arriving at the surface. The autumn was the happiest Alice had experienced in years, and the happiness had its own distinct Kansas quality, practical and immediate, rooted in work and weather, and the specific texture of days lived with full attention. There was the garden harvest, which was good enough to stock her root cellar and leave a surplus she sold at the Dodge City market. There was the first real winter preparation, cutting and stacking hay, banking the sod walls with extra earth, laying in coal and wood. There was the Carlisle Outfit's fall cattle drive, which took Roscoe north for 3 weeks in October, which Alice spent working harder than usual because work was a better occupation than waiting, though she found she was doing both. He came back from the cattle drive on a gray October afternoon, and she was at the creek filling water barrels, and she looked up to see him riding down the hill on Calico with his hat tilted against the wind, and the sight of him hit her somewhere in the middle of her chest with a force that she thought was probably something she should have been more prepared for. He pulled up at the creek and swung down and looked at her with the same expression he had been looking at her with since the bean row, warm and direct and slightly wondering, like he still was not entirely sure of his luck. "How were the cattle?" she asked. "Cattle are cattle," he said. "How is the claim?" "Still mine," she said. "Every inch." He kissed her then, which was better than the bean row because they were both standing and there was no garden to navigate, and he held her in both arms and she let him, and the gray autumn sky was very large around them and very beautiful. Pruitt made one more attempt. In November, he sent 2 of his hands to pull up the corner stakes on the eastern boundary of Alice's claim, which would have moved her line 20 yards west and given him access to a stretch of the creek she used for her winter water. It was a crude tactic and a dangerous one, and it happened at night while Alice was asleep. She discovered it at first light when she walked the fence line, as she did every morning, and she stood at the missing stakes with her breath making clouds in the cold air, and felt a fury so complete and clean that it was almost like peace. She documented it. She had Roscoe witness it when he came out that morning, which was not a Sunday but a Tuesday, because he had taken to coming more often now with a casualness that had the quality of a habit he intended to keep. They rode to the county sheriff together, a man named Walt Aldridge who was decent if somewhat reluctant to take on wealthy ranchers, and Alice set out her documentation with the methodical clarity of a schoolteacher presenting evidence of a student's misbehavior. Aldridge rubbed his mustache. "Miss Archer, these things are hard to prove." "I have the original survey documentation," Alice said. "I have witness testimony that the stakes were present yesterday morning. I have the current state of the line, which I can show you. Harlan Prewitt's hands were seen on my eastern boundary 2 weeks ago by Thomas Hale's clerk, who was riding past. Would you like me to produce him?" Aldridge looked at Roscoe. "Do not look at me," Roscoe said mildly. "She has everything she says she has." Aldridge went out to Alice's claim the following day with a county surveyor. The survey confirmed that the stakes had been moved from their recorded positions. Aldridge rode to Prewitt's ranch and had a conversation that Alice was not present for but whose results she experienced in the form of Harlan, Prewitt's sudden and complete disengagement from her corner of the world. She never knew exactly what Aldridge said, but the tampering stopped, and Prewitt's hands gave her land a wide berth for the remainder of that season and every season after. She suspected, though she never confirmed this, that Roscoe Cooper had also had a private word with someone in Prewitt's employ, someone who had reason to trust a fellow rider's assessment of which situations were worth continuing and which were not. She did not ask, because she thought the answer might require her to be more grateful than was comfortable, and because she suspected that if she asked, Roscoe would tell her the truth, and the truth was that he had simply done what needed doing with the directness she was coming to recognize as the central fact of his character. December came with its hard Kansas cold, the wind coming off the flat land with nothing to stop it, and Alice's sod house, which had been warm enough in autumn, proved its virtues in full. The thick earth walls held the heat of her stove like cupped hands, and she had fuel enough and food enough and a cat she had acquired in Dodge City named Harris who was orange and opinionated, and kept the soddy free of mice with professional dedication. Roscoe came out most evenings after his work at the Carlisle outfit was done, riding 3 miles in the dark with equanimity. She always had coffee. They would sit at her small table by the stove and sometimes talk and sometimes read, he with whatever newspaper he had managed to acquire and she with her books, and Harris would settle on whatever lap was warmest, alternating his loyalty based on some calculus only he understood. It was not formal courtship in any of the ways she had been taught to recognize courtship. There were no parlors, no calling cards, no chaperones, no elaborate performances. It was simply 2 people who had chosen each other's company above all other company available to them, and who became more themselves in each other's presence, and who were in love, plainly and without decoration. On a cold December evening when the wind was making noise against the sod walls and the stove was burning well, Roscoe looked up from his newspaper and said, without any particular preamble, "I have been thinking about what comes next." Alice looked up from her book. "I am a cowhand," he said with the directness she knew. "I have savings from 6 years of work and careful spending, not a great deal but some. I have been thinking about land." "Your own claim," she said. "Near yours," he said. He held her gaze. "If you are agreeable." She was quiet for a moment. Harris moved from her lap to the floor as if clearing the space for whatever was about to happen. "That is not the same as asking me to marry you," she said. "No," he agreed. "It is not." He set down the newspaper. "I did not want to assume. I know what this land means to you. I know what your independence means to you. I would never want you to feel that marrying me meant becoming less than what you already are." She looked at him for a long time. The stove ticked. The wind pushed at the walls. "Roscoe," she said. "Yes. I have been alone and I have been with people, and alone is not better," she said. It was necessary. It was the right choice for the right time, but necessary is not the same as preferred. She paused. "I would not be less than what I am if I married you. I would be the same thing I am now but with you, and I think that is more." Something moved through his face. He stood up from his chair and came around the small table and went down on one knee, which he did not have to do, which was formal in a way that neither of them was, but she understood it, understood that he was choosing formality to show her that he took it seriously. "Alice Archer," he said, "will you marry me?" "Yes," she said. "Obviously, yes." He laughed, the warm, unguarded laugh, and took her hands in both of his, and the wind outside made its large Kansas sound and the stove burned, and Harris came back and investigated the situation, and decided it did not require his involvement, and returned to the warm spot near the stove. They were married in March of 1883, which was practical for several reasons, the chief of which was that March was before the planting season, and therefore the best time to take a day away from the land. The ceremony was held in the Dodge City Church, a modest affair performed by a minister named Reverend Cobb, who had a warm manner and a genuine gift for brevity, which Alice appreciated. Thomas Hale came, and two of Roscoe's friends from the Carlisle outfit, good-natured men named Bill Farris and Sam Teague, who wore their best shirts, and spent most of the celebration drinking the punch and arguing comfortably about cattle. Alice wore a dress she had made herself from good ivory wool, not white, which was impractical, but close enough that the distinction did not matter. She had put her hair up properly for the occasion and found a ribbon that matched the wool, and when Roscoe saw her come through the church door on the arm of Thomas Hale, who stood in for a father she did not have, the expression on his face was something she knew she would remember for the rest of her life. It was not simply admiration. It was recognition, the look of someone seeing clearly a thing they already loved. He had pressed his good shirt and polished his boots and left his hat at the door, and he was waiting at the front of the small church with his hands at his sides and his back straight, and when she reached him, he took her hand and she felt the steadiness in it. Reverend Cobb kept it appropriately short. They made their promises in plain language, and meant them with the full weight of two people who understood what a promise was, and did not make them lightly. When it was done and they stepped out into the March sunlight, which was the clear, cold gold of early spring, Alice felt something she recognized from other moments of arrival, from the steps of the land office, from the doorway of her sod house, from the bean row, the feeling of a thing becoming real that she had worked toward with her full self. "Mrs. Cooper," Roscoe said, testing the words. "Alice Archer Cooper," she said firmly. "Both," he grinned. "Both," he agreed, without argument, which she loved him for. Roscoe filed his own homestead claim on the adjacent quarter section that spring, and the two claims together gave them 320 acres, which was enough, with work, to build something serious. He had his savings and she had hers, and together they made plans on the kitchen table in the evenings that grew more detailed and more ambitious as the spring advanced. The sod house was expanded. A proper barn went up over the summer, built with lumber hauled from Dodge by a wagon Roscoe drove himself 3 times over 2 weeks. They bought 2 horses in addition to Calico, a team of working animals that could handle the breaking plow, and they broke 60 acres of new sod between May and September, which was brutal, back-breaking work, the kind that made you sleep without difficulty and wake knowing exactly what your body was made of. They grew wheat on the new fields. The Kansas prairie was showing itself to be extraordinarily suited to wheat, something that experienced farmers in the territory had been saying for years, and that Alice had read enough to believe before she planted her first grain. The 1883 harvest was modest but real, enough to pay Thomas Hale his remaining $5, and enough to make a first payment on a proper stove to replace the small camp model she had been using. Their life had a texture to it that Alice had not entirely anticipated, not because she had not imagined domesticity, but because the reality of it was different from the imagination. She had expected to feel constrained, perhaps, in the way that wives in the lives she had observed were constrained. She did not. She felt enlarged, which was unexpected and worth noting. Roscoe's presence on the land did not diminish her relationship with it. It complicated and deepened it, because he saw things she did not see, and she saw things he did not see, and the combination of their observations was better than either alone. He was not a man who required managing or caretaking or performing for. He did his work and she did hers, and they did a great deal of it together. And at the end of every day, they came to the same table and the same lamp and the same conversation. And she thought more than once that she had not known this was what she was looking for, because she had never seen it modeled, had only ever seen marriages that subtracted from women rather than adding to them, and had therefore quite logically concluded that marriage itself was the problem. The problem, she now understood, had been the particular marriages she had seen, not the idea itself. She became pregnant in the late autumn of 1883, which she determined with the practical knowledge of a woman who has always paid attention to her own body, and she told Roscoe on a cold November evening with the kind of directness that was their established mode of communication. He was at the table sharpening a knife when she said, "I believe we are going to have a child in the summer." He set the knife down very carefully and looked at her. "Are you certain?" he said. "Reasonably," she said. "About as certain as these things can be at this stage." He was quiet for a moment, and she watched his face move through something, a sequence of things she could see but not entirely translate, and then it settled into the expression she associated with his truest feelings, open and warm and a little wondering. "Come here," he said. She went to him and he put his arms around her, standing beside the kitchen table, and held her with a careful strength that had a kind of reverence in it, and she felt his face against her hair. "A child," he said quietly. "Yes," she said, "so we have a good deal to do before summer." He laughed, muffled against her hair, and the laugh turned into something else, something quieter and more serious, and she held on to him for a long moment in the lamplight, with the Kansas winter pressing at the walls and Harris observing from the chair by the stove. The pregnancy was not easy, which was common enough for any woman in 1883 on a working farm in Kansas without proximity to a doctor, but Alice faced it with the same organized practicality she brought to everything else. She identified the nearest physician in Dodge City, a man named Dr. Wendell Prout, and made arrangements with him early. She adjusted her workload as the months advanced, not eliminating it, which Roscoe did not suggest because he knew better, but redistributing it toward tasks that were less physically hazardous. Roscoe took on the heavier work without commentary, without making her feel managed, simply doing what needed doing because it needed doing. The winter passed. The spring of 1884 came in with a ferocity of growth that astonished Alice every year, no matter how many times she had experienced the Kansas spring by then. The wheat came up green and strong. The garden was twice as large as the first year. The barn held their horses and a milk cow they had purchased in February, and 4 chickens, which had become 12 by April on the basis of the chickens' own initiative. In June, with Dr. Prout present and Roscoe somewhere outside the house performing the traditional task of anxious waiting that the period assigned to fathers, Alice gave birth to a son. He arrived with a strong voice and a dark flush of hair, and the immediate, emphatic opinion that the world outside was not what he had been led to expect. Roscoe came in and stood at the edge of the room and looked at Alice, who was tired in a way she had not previously known tiredness to exist, and at the bundle in her arms, and he looked the way she had expected him to look, which was overwhelmed in the best possible sense of the word. "He is healthy," Dr. Prout said, "and so is your wife. She did very well." Roscoe crossed to the bed and sat beside Alice and looked at his son with an expression that had no practical equivalent in his usual repertoire. "He is very small," he said. "He will not stay small," Alice said. "They do not. What shall we call him?" They had discussed names. They had several candidates, but looking at the baby now, Alice felt certain about one of them. "James," she said. "James Archer Cooper." Roscoe looked at her. "Archer," he said. "He is both of ours," she said. "Both names." Roscoe looked at his son, whose name was James Archer Cooper, who was very small and very loud and was at this moment expressing an opinion about the light. He bent and kissed Alice's forehead, and she felt the warmth of him, that steady particular warmth that was the most reliable thing in her world. James grew quickly, as babies do, through the summer and into autumn, and then into the following years with a speed that made Alice feel time differently than she had before. He was a sturdy, cheerful child with his father's brown eyes and his mother's stubborn jaw, who learned to walk by the previous fall and to talk with great enthusiasm shortly after, and who by the age of 2 had established himself as the primary interest of Harris the cat, who had revised his opinion of small humans upward considerably upon acquaintance. The farm continued to grow. Their wheat acreage expanded. They added an apple orchard in 1885, small trees that would not fruit for years, but that were an investment in the future, in the particular way that planting trees is always an investment in a future you believe in. They hired a man named Otto Braun, a German immigrant in his 40s who was a skilled farmer and a quiet, reliable presence, and with Otto's help they broke another 40 acres and added winter wheat to their rotation. In 1886, they had a second child, a daughter this time, who arrived with considerably less drama than her brother and more efficiency, as if she had been listening to Alice's approach to all things and had internalized it. They called her Margaret, and she was from the beginning a thoughtful, watchful child who would eventually grow into exactly the kind of woman that her mother was, which Alice observed with a satisfaction she could not fully put into words. Alice had been, and remained, the first woman to file a land claim alone in that part of Kansas. She knew this, not because she thought of it constantly, but because it had become a small, specific fact about her life that other people occasionally mentioned. Other women had begun filing since. She knew of 4 in their immediate area, and 2 of them had come to her for advice on the process, which she gave freely and in detail. She felt about this something that was less pride than responsibility, a sense that the path she had insisted on walking was worth keeping clear for others. Thomas Hale had become a friend in the way that attorneys sometimes do, particularly when they have been useful at a difficult time. He told her once, in 1885, that her claim had been cited in a letter from the Kansas Land Commissioner's office as an example of proper documentation and process, and that Prewitt's failed challenge had been noted in regional land office records as a cautionary instance of informal grazing arrangements. She found this very satisfying. Harlan Prewitt had eventually sold most of his operation and moved south to Texas, which Alice heard through the Dodge City networks that carried all significant local news. She felt about this primarily a mild relief, the way you feel when weather that has been threatening to worsen simply decides not to. The prairie around them changed over the years, as more settlers arrived and the territory became denser with human life, but the particular landscape of their land, the creek and the bluff and the long southwestern views, remained constant in a way that felt like a promise kept. Alice walked her fence lines every morning still, a habit she had begun in the first weeks of her claim and had never abandoned. She knew every corner stake, every gate, every stretch of ground on those 320 acres. She knew it the way you know a thing you have earned. Roscoe remained, throughout these years, essentially himself, which was one of the most significant things about him. He was a man who did not require reinvention or management, who grew incrementally in the way that good farmland grows, more productive with each season, deeper with each winter. He had left the Carlisle outfit formally in 1884 when their own farm required full-time attention, and he had made the transition from hired cowhand to farmer-landowner with the adaptability of someone who had always been more interested in good work than in the category the work fell into. He was still, underneath everything, a man who had grown up with horses and cattle and open country, and this showed in how he handled animals, how he read weather, how he knew instinctively what land was telling you when you paid attention. He brought this to their farm and it made the farm better, and Alice brought her schoolteacher's precision and her reader's habit of finding out what she did not know, and the combination continued to be, as it had been in the Bean Row, more than either part. He still made her laugh. This was not incidental. This was, she thought sometimes, the infrastructure of a good marriage, the laughter that came up unexpectedly and made the harder parts navigable. He had a dry, particular wit that came out most often at the end of long days when they sat together at the table while the children slept, and she had learned to read the slight shift in his expression that meant something was coming, and to wait for it with anticipation. In 1888, when James was 4 and Margaret was 2, Roscoe had a bad fall from calico in the east field, his boot catching in the stirrup and the horse startling at a snake, and he broke 2 ribs and his left wrist and was off his feet for 6 weeks, which was a significant difficulty for a working farm. Alice managed the farm during this time with Otto Braun's help and with a level of organization that impressed Roscoe, who was too uncomfortable to be genuinely helpless but tried to be, which she appreciated. What she remembered from those 6 weeks later, beyond the practical difficulties, was the evenings. He was in pain and could not sleep well, and she would sit beside him in the dim light, and they would talk, the long, unhurried talk of people who have time and nothing else to do with it. He told her things about himself during those weeks that she had not known, not because he had been hiding them, but because the right moment had not previously presented itself. About the year in Colorado, about a friend he had lost in a cattle accident when he was 24, about what he had believed and what he had stopped believing and what he had concluded was worth believing. She told him things too, about Edmund the schoolteacher and why she had not married him, which was not, she said, because he was not good, but because she had been afraid that being married to someone good was not sufficient reason to be married. About her mother, who was still living in Ohio, and with whom Alice exchanged letters every 3 weeks, a correspondence that was warm and careful in the way of 2 women who love each other and have spent years navigating a significant difference in how they believed life should be lived. "Do you regret it?" Roscoe asked one of those evenings, the lamp turned down, the children asleep in the next room, not settling for the easier thing. "There is no easy thing I gave up," she said. "There was a smaller life in this life. I chose this one." "This is not small," he said. "No," she agreed. "It is not. It is very large." She paused. "Larger than I imagined when I imagined it." He reached for her hand with his good hand, his right, and held it. "I am glad you came to Dodge City that morning," he said. "I am glad you walked into the land office," she said. "I was there for wire and shipping papers," he said. "I know," she said. "And you got those too, I assume." "I did," he said. "Eventually." He laughed quietly, which made him wince because of the ribs, and she pressed his hand and said nothing because no words were needed. He healed. By autumn he was back at full capacity, and the farm had survived his absence without permanent damage, and the experience, unpleasant as it was, had left them with the particular closeness that comes from people who have seen each other at their most vulnerable and have not found anything there that reduced their love. The year 1889 brought the Oklahoma land rush to the news, and Dodge City was full of people moving south to take part, a great westward and southward surge of human ambition that Alice watched with a kind of informed sympathy. She knew what it felt like to want land badly enough to fight for it. She also knew that the Oklahoma Territory's situation was considerably more complicated than the Kansas openings had been, because the land being opened was land that had been treaty land, and the people losing it had not given it up voluntarily, and this was an injustice of a kind that she had thought about more as the years went on, and her knowledge of the country deepened. She had seen the Cheyenne and Arapaho peoples on the Kansas plains, had known from the beginning that the land she had claimed had a history before her. She had tried to hold this carefully, had tried to understand that being part of a settlement system that displaced indigenous peoples was a moral complication that no amount of personal virtue entirely resolved. She talked about this with Roscoe, who had his own complicated feelings about it, having been raised in Missouri where the displacement of native peoples was sufficiently historical to be uncomfortable rather than immediate, but who had worked alongside Comanche and Kiowa men in his cattle years, and had carried a different understanding of the land and its prior claims than many of his contemporaries. "We cannot undo what has been done," he said. "But we can be honest about what it was." "Yes," Alice said, "we can do that." It was not a complete resolution. She did not believe there was one, but honesty was what she had and she chose to use it. In 1890, the year James turned 6 and started at the Spearville School, which required a 2-mile ride on the pony they had purchased for him, Alice received a letter from a woman in Nebraska named Clara Benson, who had read about Alice's land claim through a network of correspondence that connected women homesteaders across the territory. Clara was planning to file her own claim and was afraid, and wanted to know how Alice had done it. Alice wrote back a long letter, longer than any she had written in years, and she described every step of the process in detail, every document and every law and every argument, and she described Gerald Sutton's face and Harlan Prewitt's challenge and Thomas Hale, and the bean row where the confirmation letter had found her sitting in the dirt. She described the feeling of standing in the doorway of her sod house on the evening it was finished. She wrote, "You will be afraid. The fear is legitimate because the people who push back are real and they push hard. Document everything. Know the law better than any man in that office. And find the people worth trusting because they exist, even in the places you least expect them." Clara Benson filed her claim in the spring of 1891. She wrote to Alice about it afterward. The clerk had tried to delay her. She had had her documentation in order and had not moved. Alice kept the letter and showed it to Roscoe, who read it and nodded. "Good," he said simply. "Good," she agreed. The years arranged themselves into the pattern of farming life, which is nothing like the pattern of other lives, being organized by seasons rather than by weeks, by harvests rather than by salaries, by the specific patience of people who have learned that the land does not hurry, and that hurrying the land is the one certain way to ruin things. Their children grew. James was tall and serious, and had his father's way with animals and his mother's capacity for organized argument, which were excellent combined qualities. Margaret was quieter and more watchful and had a gift for mathematics that Alice recognized as something to be encouraged, not managed away, and which she fed with every book and opportunity she could find. In 1893, a drought year, they lost half their wheat and most of the corn, and the financial difficulty was genuine and frightening for a time. They ate from the root cellar and the garden, which the drought damaged less than the field crops because Alice had positioned it near the creek and built her irrigation channels carefully over the previous years. They sold one of the horses and tightened every other expenditure, and they did not lose the farm, though Alice understood in that year what losing the farm would have meant, and the understanding made her grateful in a visceral way that fair years did not quite produce. Roscoe did not panic in the drought year. He was worried, she could see it, but he did not panic, and his steadiness was the most practically useful thing he contributed to that period, which was saying a great deal given that he also worked harder than she had ever seen him work. He was up before dawn every day checking the creek levels and the field moisture, and doing the arithmetic of survival with a competence that she respected enormously. "We will get through this," he said, not as comfort but as assessment, and he was right. By 1894, the rains had come back and the wheat was good and the farm was sound. They replanted what they had lost, added more apple trees, which were now beginning to produce fruit, and Alice allowed herself the particular relief of a person who has been tested and has not broken. In the fall of 1895, they sat together on the hill above the creek in the last warm light of the season, a thing they had taken to doing on autumn evenings when the farm permitted it, which was not often enough but often enough to count. Below them the land stretched out to the flat horizon, 320 acres of it theirs in every legal and practical and spiritual sense. The wheat fields golden in the late light, the orchard putting out the last of the season, the barn solid and red against the grass. The house expanded now from the original soddy into a proper wood-frame structure with a real kitchen and a porch that faced the sunset. James was 11 and had taken to doing his schoolwork at the kitchen table with the focused attention of a boy who has understood that knowledge is a form of territory and that claiming it is worth the effort. Margaret was 9 and was currently at the creek with a collection of rocks she had been sorting by type and color for reasons that satisfied her scientific curiosity and no other discernible purpose. Alice had her knees up and her arms around them and was looking at the horizon with the expression Roscoe had long ago learned to recognize as her thinking face, not troubled but occupied, turning something over. "What is it?" he said. "I was thinking about the first morning," she said. "I rode into Dodge with the flour sack." "Were you scared?" "Profoundly," she said. "I was absolutely certain I was going to go through with it and absolutely certain that something was going to go wrong." "Something did go wrong," he said. Sutton was manageable," she said. "I was more afraid of what came after, of proving up and failing to prove up, of Pruitt, of the drought, of all the ways it could end badly." She paused. "I was afraid I had aimed at something too large." "You did not," he said. "No," she said. "I did not." She looked at him. He was sitting beside her with his long legs stretched out and his hat tipped back, the evening light on his face, the gray that had started at his temples over the last few years giving him a distinction she found genuinely attractive, not despite his age but because of it, because it was evidence of the years they had accumulated together. "I would not have done it without you," she said. "Not the claim itself. I would have done that, but everything after. You would have managed Pruitt," he said. "Eventually," she said, "but you made it faster," he laughed. It was a reference to the first morning, to what she had said to him on the boardwalk outside the land office, and he knew it and she knew he knew it, and the laugh had in it 13 years of accumulated understanding. She leaned over and rested her head against his shoulder, and he put his arm around her, and they sat on the hill above their land in the fading light and watched the sun go down over the Kansas prairie, which was doing what it had always done, indifferent and magnificent. Margaret called up from the creek with some rock-related announcement that required a response, and Alice called back, and James came out of the house onto the porch to see what was happening, and the ordinary domestic noise of it was very dear and very complete. "We should go in," Alice said, eventually. "Supper." "In a minute," he said. He was looking at the horizon still, the last gold of the light. She looked at him looking at it. She thought about the man who had walked into the land office on a morning 13 years ago for wire and shipping papers, and had made a practical decision to stand beside a woman he did not know. She thought about the bean rows and the December kitchen and the March church and the drought year and the creek below them now and the children and the house and the sound of the land at evening. "I love you," she said, because it was true and because she said it regularly and without ceremony, the way you treat things that are important, with frequency and without decoration. "I love you," he said the same way. "And then, come on, supper." They went down the hill together, and James came off the porch to help, and Margaret came up from the creek with her rocks and opinions about them, and the four of them went into the house and made supper as the Kansas night came on around them, dark and full of stars, enormous and old and entirely indifferent to the small, warm-lit square of that one house on the prairie, where two people who had found each other by accident and chosen each other with everything they had were eating supper with their children and making plans for tomorrow, and the day after that, and all the days after that, which was the most ordinary and most extraordinary thing in the world. The apple trees flowered in the spring of 1896, and the orchard came into full production for the first time, a thing Alice had been anticipating since she planted the first trees 10 years earlier with the patient conviction that she would be here to see them fruit. She was here. She walked through the flowering trees in the April morning with blossoms falling around her in the light wind, and thought that this was what it looked like when you stayed somewhere long enough. Thomas Hale had retired the previous year, and she had gone to his retirement celebration in Dodge City and shaken his hand, and told him that he had been one of the most useful people she had ever known, which was her highest compliment and which he understood as such. Roscoe had taken on an informal role with 3 of the younger homesteaders in the area, men who had arrived more recently, and who came to him with practical questions about farming in this particular territory, questions about water management and soil, and which crops survived which conditions. He answered these with the same quiet competence he brought to everything, and it gave him a satisfaction she recognized, the satisfaction of a person who has learned something difficult and is now able to pass it on. In 1897, Alice wrote a piece for the Dodge City newspaper at the editor's request, a practical account of homesteading as a single woman, of the legal process and the common obstacles and the methods of documentation and resistance. It was published in early spring, and she received, over the following months, 11 letters from women across the territory who had read it. Several of them filed claims in the year that followed. She did not think of herself as a pioneer in any romantic sense. She thought of herself as a person who had known what she wanted and had gone after it with the available tools, which was a description she would have applied to most of the useful things she had ever heard of. But she understood that the fact of it, the plain fact of being first, of being the one who proved a thing was possible when other people said it was not, had meant something to people who came after, and she was glad of that. Roscoe read the newspaper piece when it was published and set it down and looked at her across the breakfast table. "That is very good," he said. "Thank you," she said. "I learned things I did not know," he said, "about what you were thinking that first morning." "You could have asked," she said. "I was not sure I had the right at first," he said. "You were very self-contained." "I was terrified," she said. "You did not look it." "That was the whole point," she said and smiled. James went to study at a college in Lawrence in 1902, which was a source of enormous pride and a significant financial arrangement that they had been planning for years. He wanted to study agricultural science, which seemed to Alice both practically sensible and poetically appropriate, and which Roscoe supported with a directness that brooked no sentimentality about boys staying close to home. "He should go," Roscoe said. "He is ready." "He is 18, Alice said. "You were 26 when you rode into Dodge City alone," Roscoe said. "He is better prepared than you were." "He is," she agreed, "because of what we built." Margaret, at 16, was already the best mathematician in her school and had designs on studying further that Alice was actively supporting against the mild resistance of a social world that had not yet entirely caught up with itself on the question of what women's education was for. Alice had her own opinions on this question, and they were not mild. She wrote to Margaret's teacher, a kind but limited man named Mr. Abrams, a letter of 2 pages explaining in precise terms why Margaret's mathematical talent was an asset to the world and not a curiosity to be managed, and suggesting specific resources the school could provide. Mr. Abrams, to his credit, took the letter seriously, and Margaret's opportunities expanded accordingly. On a spring evening in 1903, Roscoe and Alice sat on the porch of their expanded farmhouse with coffee and the mild, particular satisfaction of people who have worked hard for a long time and are sitting down for a moment in the middle of the result. The land around them was fully in production, the orchard mature and productive, the wheat fields planted, the pastures good, the barn solid, the house comfortable and full of the accumulated objects of 20 years of living, books and tools and quilts and photographs, and the rocks of Margaret's collection, which had become a serious geological interest and was no longer stored solely at the creek. Harris the cat had died of old age in 1892 and had been succeeded by a series of other cats, none of whom had quite his personality, but all of whom had served their function admirably. The current cat was gray and very dignified and was called Senator, which was James's name for him from his last visit home and which had stuck. The prairie was still there. It was still enormous. It was denser with human settlement now than it had been in 1882, but the fundamental quality of it, the great flatness and the large sky and the wind that came from everywhere, had not changed, because it was the kind of thing that did not change on human timescales. 20 years next year, Roscoe said from his chair. From the claim, Alice said. Yes. From the land office, he said. From you telling Sutton about subordinate clauses. He was wrong about the subordinate clause, she said. He was, Roscoe said, most memorable morning of my life up to that point. And after, she said, he was quiet for a moment. The day James was born, he said, and Margaret, and the day you said yes in the bean row, and the day we got through the drought and the rain came back, he considered. And Sunday mornings, all of them. She looked at him. He was 50 now, and the gray had gone from the temples through the rest of his hair, and his face was the face of a man who had been outdoors for 30 years, weathered and quiet and entirely itself. She thought he was the most familiar thing in her world and still, consistently, the most interesting. All of them, she agreed. She reached across and put her hand over his on the porch railing, and he turned his hand and held hers, and the evening settled around them, the familiar Kansas evening with its big sky going orange and then purple, and then the full dark with the stars coming out one by one. Inside, Margaret was doing mathematics at the kitchen table. In Lawrence, James was studying agricultural science and writing a letter home. The land stretched in every direction, productive and real, marked by their labor and their years. The apple trees in full leaf were dark shapes in the gathering dark. This was the life, not the life before it which had been necessary and worthy. Not the imagined life, which had been smaller. This one, the one she had built by standing at a counter with a flour sack and refusing to move, the one that had included a tall cowboy walking through a door at the right moment, the one that had grown through drought and challenge and hard seasons, and the particular grace of two people who chose each other well. Alice sat on her porch with her husband's hand in hers and her land around her and felt, again, as she had felt at various points across all these years in various forms, that she had arrived, not at a destination, not at a place where nothing more would happen, but at a life, at the full, complicated, deeply satisfying thing itself. The stars came out over Kansas. The night was warm. Senator the cat came out through the door and settled at their feet with the authority of an animal who knows whose porch this is. It was, she thought, a very good place to be.